Hello, good people. My name is Carla Dupre. I'm the executive director of CityLit Project, and all I can say is welcome. Welcome to the 10th edition of our CityLit Studio, Writers on Craft, Creativity, and Community. 10 years ago, this free fall event was established through Create Baltimore, formerly the Baltimore Office of Promotion in the Arts. We wanted to showcase both regional and national authors in a free learning space. And while it changes each year, we love the idea of presenting two ways of approaching writing with two authors we hold in deep regard. And tonight is no different. We thank our many sponsors who made this event possible, including Create Baltimore, the Maryland State Arts Council, Maryland Humanities, T. Rowe Price Foundation, Robert W. Deutsch Foundation, the Baker Memorial Foundation, and Insight 180, among others. We also thank Greedy Reads, which we've included a link to purchase the books from these two presenting authors. We also want to thank you for joining us on an evening when we know you could be anywhere else, but you're here with us. We thank you for that. After this event, we ask that you hang out with us for a few minutes to answer a brief evaluation so we can improve your experience in future endeavors. A few other things. I know in Zoom rooms, we don't always want to be seen in our loungewear. We want you to get comfortable, but trust it's a more intimate experience for our authors to see your beautiful faces once they get through their slide presentations and to read your expressions. For those of you returning from our Write Like a Mother retreat in Sedona, we understand you may be too tired to turn your cameras on, but we would love to see you too. We're glad to have you here with us. For others, as much as you can, please turn on your cameras, and we ask each of you to stay on mute. If you need to take a short break along the way and between talks, of course, please take care of yourselves throughout the duration of this event. The chat is wide open. We want you to respond, remark, praise, and ask questions. We've got you covered and we welcome it. We are going to ask that if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, we haven't done Zoom in a while, so but please write us in the chat and our City Lit Gladiator, Christina Mullins, will be monitoring it and she will assist you. I'd like to now introduce you to my esteemed executive assistant, Lillian Jacobson, who will guide you on how to make the most of this Zoom experience. Take it away, Lillian.
Thank you, Carla, and hello, everyone. I would like to just do a very quick, very brief Zoom overview. As Carla said, it's been a minute since we've been on Zoom, so we want to make sure everyone is accustomed. Maybe Zoom has updated for you and you haven't been on in a minute. So let's just get into it. On the screen, you will see what the bottom of your Zoom window looks like. Here I have a pink arrow pointed down to where the microphone is. As Carla mentioned, please keep your microphone muted while the authors are presenting. There will be a Q&A at the end, and we will then invite you to unmute to ask a question. Next to the microphone button is a video icon. You can use that to turn on and off your camera. Again, please keep your camera on when possible. It is hard to present and you just see a lot of black screen staring back at you. So please give Jeannie and Sarah your attention as possible. And here, the pink arrow is now pointing to the chat icon. You can put questions in. We will save them till the end, though. But as Carla mentioned, if you are experiencing some sort of technical difficulty, please put that in the chat as well. Please put praise, whatever you're feeling, and we will be monitoring that for you. And finally, you'll see an orange arrow pointing to the raised hand feature. We'll be using that today for the Q&A. So again, during that time, you'll be prompted to write into the chat or to raise your hand. And that is it for our very brief Zoom overview. I know you did not want to listen to me describe Zoom all night. So back to you, Carla.
Okay. We're going to get right to it because what we don't want to do is take up this time, this valuable time. I'd like to introduce you to the first author presenting. Her name is Jeannie Vanasco. She came out with this book called A Silent Treatment. She's the author of A Silent Treatment, which Booklist in its starred review described as a beautiful gift to all who have struggled to care for a loved one in the way they need it. In this new work, Jeannie guides us through her mother's childhood, their shared past, and the devastating silence of their present. She paints a layered, complicated portrait of a mother and daughter looking, failing, and in big and small ways, succeeding to understand each other. Her other memoirs include Things We Didn't Talk About, When I Was a Girl, a New York Times Editor's Choice, and The Glass Eye, which poets and writers deem one of the five best literary nonfiction debuts of 2017. Today, Jeannie shares how to tell the truth in a memoir by way of poetry. Please welcome her to our virtual stage.
Hey, hi there, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I wasn't nervous until I heard it was going to be recorded, so I'm gonna try my best. I'm gonna share my screen. Um, so can you all see that okay? Okay. All right, great. So just a little bit of background, like why this subject interests me. Well, I never thought I would write like a memoir, and then my third just came out. I have a fourth under contract. And I always thought I was going to write poetry, and that was really my first love. And my first graduate degree was in poetry, my first MFA. And in undergrad, poetry was kind of the foundation of everything we studied, and you had to take poetry before you could take any other creative writing class. And so that has had an influence on me. So I should say that what works for me, it's kind of a disclaimer for any writing class. What works for me or like my process may not work for you or yours, but I think it's worth experimenting and just seeing what kind of possibilities are out there and how, especially if you're unfamiliar with poetry or if it's not like a genre that you um, immediately go to, like just seeing, are there some techniques though that you could take from it and that might get you excited though to read more poetry. I thought we would start with a warm-up prompt, and I was going to give us, I think, is 5 minutes too long, or is 3 minutes just to get started? I don't know. Is it? Okay. So you're not going to be able to get through all of it, but just something to get you thinking. So there are different options here. Write about a time when someone asked you what your memoir was about. How did you reply? Be spare with the dialogue. And between their dialogue and yours, include reflection and mention one object that you notice. If you finish early, write about a different time someone asked you what your memoir was about. And if your answer changed, why did it change? Did your answer depend on the person asking and or when that person asked? If no one knows you're writing a memoir, write about why you think you haven't told anyone, and then begin a sentence, maybe I haven't told anyone because. And if you're not writing a memoir, that's okay. That's interesting. Write about why you're in a memoir class. So just to get you thinking, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to set my timer for 3 minutes. So just start sketching out some ideas. Okay. All right. So we may come back to that, but I just wanted to get us started with some writing. So a lot of you are writing memoirs, but you probably like know what a memoir is. But I think it's good to begin with kind of like a common definition. So, how I'm defining it here is that a memoir processes information about a past and present. So, it could be about people, events, objects. There's that great object lesson series where someone will sometimes write a book about like a remote control, but it actually gets into the author's personal history. So memoir can kind of be about anything, but it's processed through the writer's consciousness, so revealing facets of the writer's self. So even when it's about someone or something else, the author's presence persists. The other key point is that a memoir is presented as nonfiction or true, which is not the same as saying it is all true. But if someone is calling their book a memoir, then I'm just going to defer and say, like, okay, it's a memoir. Um, what is poetry? We don't even have enough time. I don't even know where to begin to define it, but I do love this quote by Emily Dickinson. If I read a book and it makes my whole body so cold, no fire can warm me, I know that is poetry. If I feel physically as if the top of my head were taken off, I know that is poetry. These are the only ways I know it. Is there any other way? Um, and so, what interests me most about poetry, I think, is this idea of beginning with one subject and letting the poem get away from it. There's this great craft book, The Triggering Town by Richard Hugo. It's a collection of his essays of the poet Richard Hugo about the craft of writing poetry. And I think there have been a lot of books related to this subject, maybe most famously Robert Bly's Leaping Poetry. But I think Hugo describes it really beautifully. And it's kind of what distinguishes also like a personal essay from, say, like uh, an academic paper. Is like you're not setting out to prove an argument per se, right? You're starting with one subject, and it can be really interesting when it moves, when the writer's thinking is the plot, when it moves away from that. So how Hugo describes it is the triggering subject. So a poem can be said to have two subjects, the initiating or triggering subject, which starts the poem or causes the poem to be written, and the real or generated subject, which the poem comes to say or mean, and which is generated or discovered in the poem during the writing. That's not quite right because it suggests that the poet recognizes the real subject. The poet may not be aware of what the real subject is, but only have some instinctive feeling that the poem is done. And so I like that even within that excerpt, there's that self-correcting quality. And I think a lot of times the memoirs that I'm thinking of that do this are more like book length essays in the tradition of the essay of uh, where where the author thinking through something and not setting out to prove something is the whole like guiding principle. Something else that Hugo says that I like, and then I'm gonna go to some like poetry techniques. But don't be afraid to jump ahead. There are a few people who become more interesting the longer they stay on a single subject. But most people are like me, I find. The longer they talk about one subject, the duller they get. Make the subject of the next sentence different from the subject of the sentence you just put down. Depend on rhythm, tonality, and the music of language to hold things together. It is impossible to write meaningless sequences. In a sense, the next thing always belongs. In the world of imagination, all things belong. If you take that on faith, you may be foolish, but foolish like a trout. And so I'm going to go into, I'm calling them tricks. I mean, I think in a university setting, I would call them technique, be encouraged to call them techniques, but I mean, they are tricks. And a lot of the tricks we're going to look at and examples of them being used, they're foregrounding language. They're specifically like looking at a lot of repetition. And I like to think of whenever I'm stuck, something I fall back on is I let the language do the thinking for me rather than me getting stuck in my head. So we'll show some examples of what I mean by that. But some of the tricks, anidiplosis, I don't expect you to remember all of these, but that's the repetition of the last word of one clause or sentence as the first word of the next. Anaphora, a lot of you are probably familiar with that. The repetition of a word or phrase at the beginning of successive clauses, sentences, or paragraphs. Diacope, the repetition of a word or phrase after a brief interruption. I mean, a great example there would be James Bond, actually kind of a boring name, right? But when he's like Bond, James Bond, like we all know that. And suddenly through syntax, this name that's not like that interesting has become like this cultural touchstone. So it's an example of like syntax matters. Epistrophe, that's basically the opposite of anaphora. Instead of beginning on the same word or words, you're landing on them. And polyptyton, which is one of my favorites, it's the repeated use of one word as different parts of speech or in different grammatical forms. So a lot of these tricks are extremely helpful. The ones that I fall back on when I think when I'm doing like I find myself writing, I can't write, I don't know how to write. This happens a lot. And then I think, okay, well, how can I use the materiality of language to just get me thinking, get me outside of my head, so that the language can use me rather than me trying to control or use the language. So these are also examples from a lot of these are for examples from Memoir, some more like hybrid works. But this one from Miriam Gerbo, what I love is that she's kind of riffing off of anidiplosis. And I gave a presentation, she was there. I was just kind of like testing this out. And afterwards, she thanked me because she knows all this stuff. I mean, she is like an extraordinary prose stylist. Um, and so this example, maybe some of you have read her book, Mean. I began as an only child with an only language. This language was English and Spanish. My English and Spanish came from a pact my parents made, my father, and then my mother. So she's splitting it up. It's not like perfect anidiplosis. But I think that's a great example. And then I'm just going to jump ahead to Sofia Shalmiev. This is from her memoir, Mother Winter. Fun with problems, problems, the mother of all problems. Mother problems are inherent multipliers. I like that because the syntax, the repetition is basically enacting what what she's saying. Mother problems are inherent multipliers. And of course, Hanif Abdurraqib, incredible poet and writer. I may have some more examples from him, but for the sake of time, I'm just gonna move on. Claudia Rankin, her book Citizen, uh, I thought this would be a great example because it was a book that was nominated in both poetry and nonfiction autobiography categories and had won awards in both. And much to the frustration of some people who are interested in like being strict about what counts as what. Um, but I just highlight, I'm not going to read the example aloud. You'll get the slides, but I just wanted to show, I highlighted the examples of maybe, you don't know, you don't know, you don't know. And then this is from Hilton Alza's book, The Women. And this is kind of, I've got this here. You can sort of read it to yourself. But this is a great example, I think, I think he uses it beautifully. But the thing to be wary of with anaphora is people tend to remember the very beginning of something and they forget, and they forget what follows. And so that's fine. People like politicians, hundreds and hundreds of years ago would use anaphora when they would want, especially when they'd want to trick people or they would want people to forget what they were saying. And they would just emphasize the very beginning of sentences and maybe tuck stuff into later sentences. And then they could just say, well, we told you. And so with Hilton Alza's example, whenever I read this passage, I forget about a lot of the details, but what remains in my mind is this repetition, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what I think is really amazing with this passage is he covers so much material. And I think anaphora is really great when you're not sure how to click things together. And it's just by virtue of repetition that it seems as if all the material belongs together. And so this is something that I think is very important in memoir when it gets messy. And there are a lot of things you want to include, but you're like, how am I going to include that? I'm going to have to jump around in time. A device like Anaphora can hold all that disparate material together so that you don't feel like you have to go along with some received plot structure, plot point one, plot point two, whatever, that anaphora is, I think, one of the best techniques a memoirist has for moving around, and maybe most famously, but a good example is Joe Brainard's book, I Remember, where every sentence begins with I remember. And there he definitely is moving around in time. Um, and then one of my favorite memoirs, Jamaica Kincaid's My Brother. Um, this is diacope. So the repetition of a word or phrase after a brief interruption. His skin was a deep black color. I noticed that. And I thought perhaps I noticed that because I live in a place where no one is of his complexion except for me. And I am not really of his complexion. I am only of his complexion in the way of race. What I like to think about, like I love Jamaica Kincaid's prose style. And when I notice passages I love, I don't know about you all, I love to keep a commonplace book where I just keep track of like, here are some sentences that I've read that I think are really beautiful. And I like to play this game of like, it could have been otherwise. So there's a way in which this could have been written to just read, um, his skin was a deep black color. And I thought perhaps I noticed that because I live in a place where no one is of his complexion except for me. Um, and I'm not really of his complexion, or I'm only of his complexion the way of race. There's some other way it could have been, but there's something that repetition, that musicality, I think does something really beautiful. Epistrophe. Epistrophe is a great device to use when you want to give the effect of no matter where you start, you end up in the same place. Because no matter where the sentence starts, you keep ending successive sentences on the same word or words, and it emphasizes the point. I think this is comes across really beautifully in Claudia Rankine's Citizen. You never really speak except for the time she makes her request, and later when she tells you you smell good and it features more like a white person, you assume she thinks she is thanking you for letting her cheat and feels better cheating from an almost white person. And so that repetition, obviously, that does something for the emotions of that passage. And I've got some prompts tied to all of this, but polyptoton, I mentioned this one is one of my favorites. I think a really great example here is from Melissa Phoebos's essay Labyrinths from her memoir and essays, or memoirs. I think they might have split the difference and called them memoirs. Abandon Me. She has mistaken her changed perception of the labyrinth for the labyrinth's changing. So even just that adjustment of the word change, having that change, um, I think is really beautiful. And then one figure of speech that like combines anaphora and epistrophe is I think I'm pronouncing this correctly, simploche. I'm sure a rhetorician would already be poking a ton of holes in some of the stuff I'm telling you all, but I'm speaking from the point of view of a creative writer. So it's just where you combine the two. And here's an example from Mean. And I'm not going to read all of these because you'll get these handouts. So the point of like going through all of this is because of this idea of fluency bias. And fluency bias, I think, is like it's really easy to slip into with memoir writing. So fluency bias is our impulse to interpret information that's easier to process or remember as being more true or reliable. And I just remember when I was in graduate school for memoir and they're like I had just come out of graduate school for poetry. Did two MFAs. It's a great way to get health insurance. And like I don't know, that I mean it's great for other reasons, find a time to write. But I had just gotten out of the poetry MFA and I was doing this nonfiction MFA and my poor professors were like, Jeannie, like, because I was like, I can't plot is not making sense or like the way they were telling me to structure my book was not making sense because it didn't feel real to me. It felt like I was imposing meaning where there wasn't meaning or I was accentuating certain scenes that I was like, I don't think this really mattered to me at the time. I'm by exaggerating it or giving it a lot of space, I feel like I'm lying. And so that really made me feel uncomfortable. The professors were like, here's Joseph Campbell's hero's journey. Here is Freytag's triangle. Here are all of these like story forms that have been proven to be useful. And I just found it really frustrating, but I did try it. I did because I was like, well, they've published books. They know what they're talking about. What do I know? Um, and so I think that fluency bias comes into memoir writing when we are sometimes playing with those received forms. At least I'm speaking strictly with my experience. So how do you avoid it? I think avoid omitting or minimizing contradictory experiences for the sake of narrative consistency, at least during the drafting stage, right? You can't include everything, but I think that being open to including details or people that would kind of mess things up, I think that's a really good thing to do because you're going to be surprising yourself. You're going to get yourself into new places of thinking. The other thing is allow for moments of uncertainty, allow to say, like, I don't remember. Joe Brainard's I remember, I remember. You could have a series of I don't remembers. Um, and set aside the idea that there is one meaning or one answer. Like this person behaved this way because, like um, a very common thing, like I'm hearing from readers, like emails, like, do you think your mom had such and such illness? I'm like, I don't know. I never had a diagnosis, but I think we do, some of these things can be useful for understanding character. But I think it's much more interesting sometimes in the absence of information to allow someone just to show them behaving a particular way. And maybe the diagnosis is relevant. If there was one, maybe it's not, but just like allowing for contradiction, both for your own behavior and for other characters' behavior, because that's how life works. And I like to use a process journal to reflect on my writing and think about like you could try that and like reflect on why you skipped an important moment or like why you begin and end where your memoir where you do. Um, and the other ways to kind of avoid fluency bias is to like ask yourself if your interpretation is true, or is it just like is it just the clean, neat thing? It's going to help. Is this just going to help you finish your book faster? Right. And so thinking about how you're framing your questions is really important. So, for example, like if you ask yourself, you're writing about your mom, you're like, why was my mom being mean? You're more likely then to retrieve examples of when she was mean. But if you ask yourself, why was my mom being kind? You're more likely to retrieve examples of when she was kind. But the why is often impossible to answer definitively, but the why behind why you're asking, I think that can be really interesting. Um, for the sake of time, I'm going to kind of skip past this prompt, but I encourage you to kind of do it on your own time. But I think it's interesting to consider your starting place because a lot of times, speaking from experience with process, I will think that something is the beginning and I will hold on to it forever, like for way too long. Because I'm like, no, this is the opening. And then the longer I hold on to it, the longer I'm avoiding potentially a better opening. And so I think like having some of these more meta moments, at least in your process journal, can be really productive in getting you out of fluency bias. Because a lot of times as a writer, or like I self-censor because I'm like, well, that's not part of the story. But it's always the stuff that's not part of the story that I find is the story. And that I think that getting getting that in the way of myself, at least for me, like is the way that I can complete something. So I highly recommend a process journal. But here, I wanted to get to this prompt because I think this is really important. And I think this is something that we're often dealing with in memoir is obsession. Like if as writers, like you're writing something because you're obsessed with this topic. And so I something to think about is like, what is an obsession that you explore or want to explore in your memoir? And the reason why I like obsession is it provides motivation, and that's what can contribute to your narrative or reflective progression. And like answering why you're obsessed with something, that you could end up getting into like a loop of just a reflective loop. And so I think it can be helpful to, as much as I love reflection, I think it can be really helpful to think of what are some concrete ways that one can enact obsession and answering the questions, what does the character get from the obsession? So if you're not sure what to write about in this moment, writing might be the one to go with because I imagine you're all here on Zoom in a memoir class because you're obsessed with writing. So, what does the character get from the obsession? What is the character neglecting because of the obsession? What is at stake because of the obsession? Who interferes with it? And how far will the character go to pursue the obsession? So, I just want to do just like uh let's just do actually like 2.5 minutes for this, and you're not going to be able to answer all of them, but uh but just any one of these. So I'm going to set my timer. Okay. Um, so one of the things that's great that with writing about obsession, and then also if you end up like when you're revising, using some of the techniques that I mentioned, like using repetition of language, is there's a way, I mean, that's what poetry, the language is often enacting the meaning, or the form is often sometimes part of uh, is saying as much as the actual content, if not more. And so using a repetition of language is also an excellent way of emphasizing obsession. So it's why certain poets will go to like the Sestina or the Villanelle when they're writing about their obsessions. I'm thinking of Elizabeth Bishop's One Art, which is one of my favorites. Um, but when you are trying to get at what matters most in your work, and it likely has to do with like an obsession with something, whether it's a question or person or whatever. Think about slowing down, using meaningful syntax, slowing down in those moments, using anaphora or using epistrophe to enact that, to enact the obsession and emphasize the meaning. And I'm a big fan of breaking out of received structures. So I think if you're using, say, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, which there's nothing wrong with that. It can also, some writers find they do hermit crab essays, they have received forms, they find it very generative to do that kind of thing. But I think with memoir writing, if you find yourself thinking about things in terms of plot point one, plot point two, very early on, it is more likely you're going to be receptive to fluency bias because you're going to be finding examples from your life that fit a particular story. And it's why I, as a writer, I used to think, because I'd been taught and I hadn't really questioned it, but I used to think that you had to have a certain amount of hindsight perspective before you could write about something. And certainly why I felt very insecure in my 20s when I was working on a memoir. I felt so embarrassed. I didn't want to tell anyone what I was working on. Uh, and uh, I just lost sorry, it's been a while since I've been on Zoom. I lost the train of my thought. Thinking about plot point one, plot point two. Um, oh my God, I'm so sorry. What was I saying?
We were talking about
Saying that you didn't want to say what you were.
Perspective. Thank you. Thank you. Hindsight. Thank you. Yes. So I used to think that I had to wait a certain amount of time, but I have come to believe that it's that I'm writing much more honestly when I'm writing, and I learned this from keeping a process journal, when I'm writing from within an experience, when I don't necessarily know what's going to happen next. But again, I'm saying just what works for me, right, as a writer, and that's not necessarily what's going to work for somebody else. But in terms of process, I find it's really helpful to write from within an experience because then I'm much closer. Because as soon as something starts to become more of a story, as soon as more time has passed, then I'm looking back and it's like when you tell someone a story about like, something that happened to you, you start to, I don't know, like it becomes more of a persona. And that's where I think that foregrounding language rather than event can be really helpful. Um, and I like what Richard Hugo says in The Triggering Town. Never want to say anything so strongly that you give up the option of finding something better. If you have to say it, you will. Um, and then just like my point of view of this is like as a memoirist, I don't want the artistry to interfere with the honesty. So there's that. So even though I care a great deal about syntax and manipulating language in some ways or manipulating it in such a way where it seems as if it was all written in a sitting, though when I don't know a single sitting, though I don't know any book that happens that way. Even though I care a lot about the artistry, I do want to leave room for messiness, for not having the answers, for not having conclusions. And I think a lot of times that comes down to acknowledging subjectivity, of having these meta moments of saying like you don't of like I don't remember something or I don't know something. Because even though the truth may be impossible to access, that doesn't mean we don't try. I get very worried when I hear people say, like, well, isn't all memoir fiction? Isn't like, I think that's a very slippery slope to go down. Um, and I just think there are ways around falling into um, the temptation of exaggerating something. Like we all know some books that were called memoirs that the writers got in trouble because it was clear they were embellishing. So I think a lot of times that comes down to people want dramatic, they think they need really dramatic events. But to me, the most intimate or most dramatic or vulnerable thing is like when a writer shares their thinking. I mean, thinking to me is the most intimate thing one could share. So within your memoir writing, considering how rather than the events, your reflection about the events is the plot. Is not like then, and after you write, then you may identify plot point one, plot point two may not really be what we would typically think of as plot points, but some kind of realization. And I love, like, I'm talking about to tell the truth in memoir, study poetry, but then there's this poem, I'll just land on this poem by Emily Dickinson. Tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Success in circuit lies, too bright for our infirm delight, the truth's superb surprise. As lightning to the children eased, with explanation kind, the truth must dazzle gradually, or every man be blind. Um, I have some, I'm a fan of like having just like sometimes more material than necessary. I have some handouts that you'll all get after the presentation. One includes an excerpt from Virginia Woolf's unfinished memoir, Sketch of the Past. She was a big fan of memoirs. Um, and I really, the Virginia Woolf estate's doing just fine. I think if you Google Virginia Woolf Sketch of the Past, you might be able to find the complete memoir online, a PDF. But I include just an excerpt, and it's an excerpt where she writes about how really the most profound moments in a life are sometimes those small moments. She calls them, I think, the cotton wool of daily being, or something like that. And her whole goal as a writer, and if you look back at a lot of her books, it's not easy to identify like what are the plot points, particularly if we're looking at The Waves, where she's trying to invent a new structure. And while she's writing fiction, she is thinking about this idea of like of the truth. But in her love of memoir writing, she was talking about her aspiration was to figure out a way to get those smaller moments um, into a book and make that, and that those are a big part of it. I also have a handout you'll get. It's basically a memoir, semestral memoir class in like a handout where it's different topics in memoir and then different principles and some prompts related to it, some techniques you could use. So guiding, and I have a thing on there about the guiding intelligence, which I think of as like the narrator shifting and developing interpretation of the events, the plot. So you'll have that. And then a guided prompt that if this were longer, I would build in time for more writing and then discussion about what you wrote. But yeah, I hope some of that information was helpful. I know we've got some poets. I recognize some like really, we've got a lot of poets in the audience. One of them actually, I don't mean to embarrass her, but I've got her book right here, Tracy Diamond. I've been rereading it. So some of this may be uh, old old for a lot of you, you knew it, but I hope some of it was useful. And if you have any questions about any of it, I'll be here for the Q&A.
Wonderful. Let's give Jeannie a hand. Thank you, Jeannie. I've always believed that poetry is a route to a larger work that allows for a different relationship with language. So thank you for that. And thank you for opening those doors to a larger understanding of how we might utilize it. And everyone, just so you know, you will get those handouts. They're very, very important. But next up, we have Sarah Labrie. She's a Bay Area born TV writer who grew up in Houston and currently lives in LA. So her time frame is all different from ours right now. She's the author of No One Gets to Fall Apart, right here, which Laurie Moore calls a brilliant memoir, a triumph of every kind of literary perseverance. The book was named a New York Times editor's pick and notable book of the year and was highlighted by Elle, NPR, and Esquire as the best memoir of the year. Her television credits include Minx, Blind Spotting, Love Victor, and Made for Love. And this is from Stars, the presentation platform, Hulu, and HBO Max. She currently has projects in development with Hulu and UTV. She's been granted fellowships by Yaddo, McDowell, and the Austin Film Society. Today, we have the pleasure of learning how multiple stories can emerge from a singular origin point. Please join me in welcoming Sarah to our virtual stage. Take it away, Sarah.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so grateful to be here. Yeah, I'm the author of No One Gets to Fall Apart. It just came out in paperback this week. Um, the hardcover came out about a year ago, so it's really nice to be able to do this to commemorate my book's birthday. So very grateful to be here. I am actually going to touch on some of the same authors that Jeannie talked about, which I feel like it's not surprising. I think we have we're on the same wavelength about a lot of things. So we'll talk a little bit about Melissa Febos and Joe Brainerd as well. All right. I am going to share my slides. Okay. Hopefully everyone sees something that says emergent structure. Great. Okay. So I'm going to talk today about the relationship between emergence and memoir. I want to say that what I'm talking about can apply to any kind of writing, but because we're in a memoir class and I wrote a memoir, today we're talking about memoir. I will start just with a series of questions. I'll just read these out loud. The idea is to get us into sort of a questioning mindset, and then we'll do a little bit of free writing for ourselves, just a few minutes, just as an intro. So, this is an excerpt from the work of a visual artist whose name is totally escaping me, and I'm realizing now I should have put it on this slide. So apologies to that person. So, how is making a picture an act of faith? How is making a picture an act of volition? How is making a picture more than a matter of faith? How is it more than a matter of volition? How can we picture more than there is in the world? Is it possible that there is more than the world? How is a picture a possibility? How can I focus exclusively on possibilities? Where does the conflict of a question arise? Before, during, or after the question is posed? Does the conflict of a question arise as an affect inherent to its composition? Some questions begin with who, what, where, or when. Some questions begin with is, do, does, or are. Others start from if. What do all questions share, and do they differ by kind or matters of degree? Does a variety of contexts account for the differences among every question? In what way is each question a singular proposition? Where can I find a quiet place to read sitting in the sun if I haven't yet eaten breakfast? Does eating take precedence over reading when the weather is warm, and how? Is the grass green or is the sun just agreeable? Can the one who thinks solve these questions, or is the solution something that stands apart on its own, awaiting recognition? In what sense does a solution wait, as if it possesses volition? Does the satisfaction reside in an affect transmitted by the question to the answer? Is the demand of a question an issue of volition? From where does volition issue? How does a question exist apart from its source? What is the source of any question? Certainly not the person who poses it. What, if anything, am I really asking? And what answer could satisfy my curiosity with any finality? How does a work of art take shape? How does a work of art contain its very own volition? In what way is every question original? How is a question an object? Where else do objects contain their meaning but in their own compositions? Okay, so in the sort of meditative mindset that these repeated questions produce, I want to do a quick prompt. We'll just do, just
Sarah,
5 minutes, I think. Yeah.
excuse me, Sarah, is there any way you can make your screen bigger?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I don't actually know what you guys are seeing. Are you seeing my notes or you're just seeing? Okay, but it's not big enough.
Yes, it
Got
needs
it.
to be bigger.
Okay, let me see. Um, how is this?
Much better. Thank
Great.
you.
Okay, fantastic. And also you will get these slides as a handout. So we won't do 5 minutes because we don't have time. Let's do 3 minutes of just asking questions. What is the function of creative work in your life? How do you hope to feel about your work? And how do you feel about it? For 5 minutes, don't answer these questions. Write down any questions that come to mind in this arena. Just a list of questions. Don't worry too much about the rules here. The idea is just to open up the patterns in our brain that are more open-ended, right? Okay, let's do 1 more minute. Okay, so you can set those aside for now. And I want to talk today about the idea of emergence and what it is. So I'll just say by way of introduction, I'm a TV writer with a background in fiction. I have an MFA from NYU. And Jeannie, I think you and I were there at the same time. I can't remember if we figured that out or not, but you were in poetry, I was in fiction. Yes. Okay. I also work as a librettist. Librettist writes the book for opera productions in collaboration with composers. So I've written for the LA Master Chorale and had my work performed at Disney Hall and the Apollo Theater, where I'm working on an opera adaptation of Octavia Butler's Kindred, which hopefully many of you are familiar with, and we'll talk about a little bit more. And all of my work, similarly to what Jeannie was saying, I'm interested in the function of words on the page. So for me, that comes in the form of collage, of pastiche, of using quotations, repeated words, interspersing different languages, looking at words as guideposts or puzzle pieces, as parts of a larger map. As a librettist, especially, I'm sure it's similar in poetry. I found that sometimes the meanings of the words on the page are less important than the patterns and the rhythms that they create. Jeannie, which is why I so appreciated the way that you articulated that. I mean, this is something I've been thinking about, but I didn't know the actual terms that went into that. But those patterns and those rhythms are crucial. They're key to getting across the meaning that you're aiming for. So I try to work with words as material. I think of paragraphs as arrows, every sentence a tiny piece of a larger map pointing to a meaning that emerges naturally from chance juxtapositions. And I'm using the word emerge intentionally here. The definition of emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. And this is taken from Adrienne Marie Brown's book, Emergent Strategy, which is about facilitating community activism through small individual and relational changes that then spread out to improve the entire world. So she's talking about spreading change through networks, which are stronger than any individual actor. This is a line from the book that I like. Emergence is the way complex systems and patterns arise out of a multiplicity of relatively simple interactions. I will repeat these words from Nick Obolinski throughout the book because they are the clearest articulation of emergence that I have come across. In the framework of emergence, the whole is a mirror of the parts. Existence is fractal. The health of the cell is the health of the species, is the health of the planet. Also, she says nothing is wasted or a failure. Emergence is a system that makes use of everything in the iterative process. It's all data. So she's talking here about the natural world. She says, my favorite life forms right now are dandelions and mushrooms. The resilience in these structures, which we think of as weeds and fungi, the incomprehensible scale, the clarity of identity excites me. I love to see the way mushrooms can take substances we think of as toxic and process them as food, or that dandelions spread not only themselves, but their community structure, manifesting their essential qualities, which include healing and detoxifying the human body, to proliferate and thrive in a new environment. The resilience of these life forms is that they evolve while maintaining core practices that ensure their survival. A mushroom is a toxin transformer, a dandelion is a community of healers waiting to spread. What are we as humans? What is our function in the universe? So my own book, No One Gets to Fall Apart, comes out of a moment when I was working in Paris. I was actually at NYU and I was working for their NYU in Paris program. And I had an epiphany that everything in the natural world is shaped like trees. Everything branches out from a singular starting point. And one name for the shape this branching process creates is a Lichtenberg figure. And this is a figure that one comes across again and again in lightning and rivers and scars and trees, but also in vascular systems and the shapes of neurons and synapses and the patterns of ice crystals on airplane windows and the breaking off of torsos into arms and arms into hands and hands into fingers. So that time in Paris was a really weird and lonely time for me. I had been struggling to write a novel that I really was not equipped to write, but I had dedicated my life to it, and I felt like I was losing my mind. And I felt like I was hallucinating because I kept seeing this tree shape everywhere. I was living alone in France. Like I said, I was working for NYU. It was undergrad creative writing program. I was an RA for college students, and they really didn't want an RA. They had no interest in hanging out with me. They wanted to spend the summer in Paris with their friends. So I didn't know anyone, and I just felt very, very isolated. And so I'm telling you all this because I decided to put this image of the tree that I could not get away from into my novel and use it to build a character who believed that within the shape of this tree lay the answer to the question of how we might travel through a multiplicity of worlds, through a vast system of realities lying on top of each other but invisible to each other, that the philosopher called the simultaneity. And I should say this was before Marvel took over the concept of the multiverse, and it was still a relatively new idea in pop culture. This was pre Doctor Strange, etc. It was still cool. Anyway, I let this idea drive me to write a novel, and that novel wound up ultimately not working. And at the same time, my mother was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and a close friend decided abruptly to end our friendship after betraying my trust. But then I wrote a memoir that was about the novel not working and about my mother's diagnosis and about my friend. And that's the book that wound up getting published. The memoir that exists now emerged from that singular starting point, that terrible summer where it felt like I was in a black hole made out of nothing but pain and I couldn't get out. And throughout this time, I continued to explore this epiphany, this idea I thought I'd invented that everything that grows grows in the shape of a tree, that everything has this like branching shape. And I was writing about this obsession a lot. And because I was obsessed with it, I wrote a short story that ended up being seen by an editor of a literary journal. It's kind of convoluted, but he was the editor of a literary journal who was also on the board of an opera company. He hired me to co-write an opera called Hopscotch that I co-created and that I made to be about the multiverse and about the shape I was obsessed with. That got a lot of attention, and because of that, an artist in Los Angeles got wind of my work and asked me to write an essay about this obsession. And through researching that essay, I discovered something called the constructal law. And I think here I'm just kind of reiterating what Jeannie was saying about like writing about your obsessions, like follow your obsession. It will carry you. It's a wave. It's actual energy. It's something, it's a gift in some ways. I think most writers have to be obsessives in order to write, like Jeannie said. So anyway, I discovered this thing called the constructal law. I basically got to the bottom of this obsession. I got someone to pay me to write about it. And I found this book, and it was by an engineering professor named Adrian Bijan. And he works at Duke. And he was honestly writing about like air pressure. Like there's nothing artsy in what he does. He's a literal engineer. But he basically codified what I believed that I was seeing everywhere, which is that everything does in fact grow according to tree-like patterns, because that is the most efficient path for growth. So this is his book, Design and Nature, which I highly recommend if this is something you're interested in. He writes, or sorry, actually, this is not in the book. This is a summary of the book that I wrote. The constructal law is a principle in physics that describes the tendency of natural systems to evolve in ways that allow easier and more efficient flow of matter, energy, or information. And this law was first proposed by Adrian Bijan, a professor of mechanical engineering at Duke in 1996. And it's based on the idea that flow systems evolved to minimize resistance to flow, and that this process of evolution can be explained by the principle of least action. In other words, natural systems tend to evolve in ways that allow them to move or change with the least amount of effort or resistance. And the constructal law has been applied to a wide range of phenomena in physics, biology, engineering, and social sciences, including the shapes of rivers and blood vessels, the designs of power plants and airplanes and airports, and the organization of human societies. It suggests that the same basic principles of evolution and optimization apply to all types of systems, from the smallest cells to the largest social structures. Something interesting that he mentions in this book is that unlike most phenomena like this, it is something that just a normal civilian could discover, and that might be why it's not more widely known. because the sciences, especially, but everything in academia tends to be so siloed. There's something about the fact that this is so obvious and so apparent that makes people resistant to it. But at the same, it is a natural law. It's that you can walk outside and see it. You can see that your fingers branch in the same way that the tree outside your window branches. Um, and once you do see that and you start using it to structure your work and your life, it makes a huge difference. So I brought up Octavia Butler's Kindred a minute ago, and I want to talk about her a little bit more now. So I was around that time reading a lot of Octavia Butler, and she also was aware of this law. She talks about it a lot in Parable of the Sower and Parable of the Talents, which are two sort of core science fiction books about a world very much like ours, in which a young girl is trying to protect her community from the tyrant who has basically taken over the country. So she adopts this natural law, what she also observed but didn't name, into a tenet of her work. And this text, in turn, and in another example of emergence, led to the creation of emergent strategy, in which I was talking about a little bit earlier, where Adrienne Murray Brown offers, for my money, the best explanation of how we can apply this process of emergence or the constructal law or whatever you want to call it to our own lives and our own creative work. She writes, Octavia was concerned with scale, understanding that what happens at the interpersonal level is a way to understand the whole of society. In many of her books, she shows us how radical ideas spread through conversation, questions, one-to-one interactions. Social movements right now are also fractal, practicing at a small scale what we most want to see at the universal level. No more growth or scaling up before actually learning through experience. Rather than narrowing into one path forward, Octavia's leaders were creating more and more possibilities, right? Not one perfect path forward, but an abundance of futures, of ways to manage resources together, to be brilliant together. And trying to place Octavia into a context that non-sci-fi people could understand, I kept finding resonance in emergence and complex sciences. I started to pay more attention to the magic of the world, the small collective creatures who were humble and abundant and resilient. So maybe you think this is too hippy-dippy, or you're not interested in Octavia Butler or Adrienne Murray Brown, but this is a similar sentiment from a scientist, Dan Siegel. He's a neuropsychiatrist, he's at UCLA, and he's also working in the field of emergence, particularly in the question of what the mind is and how we construct the self. So he writes, the self may be viewed as a node that is part of a wider system comprised of interacting nodes. For us, that node is the body, and the self is often equated in modern times with our bodily node. But what if this view of the self as body node is limiting our sense of what's real? What if the self is also the whole system? Yes, we have a bodily self, a me, and yes, we can have small group identity, our in-group clan, but we also have a system self, our membership in a wider whole, the whole of other humans, the whole of our living planet. The self is as much the individual as it is the collective self. Differentiating and linking these layers of self cultivates an integrated identity that emerges as energy and information flow emerges within and between. So what he's saying here is that the self emerges out of the relationship between you, the individual, and everybody. You yourself are an emergent process of both your individual being and your community and the way the two integrate. You're in a constant state of flow and transformation. There is no static self. There's only you and the relationship between your body and your brain and everything outside of you, the people outside of you on an immediate level, and then your community level, and then the world. So the idea is to sort of constantly be keeping your context in mind. So I want to do a quick prompt, just in the interest of thinking about context and these within and between relationships. We're not going to have a ton of time, so I'll just read a couple of these samples, and maybe this will be helpful because, Jeannie, I know you brought Joe up, Joe Brainerd's I Remember up a couple of times, so this is an example of what it looks like. A few lines here. I remember close dancing with arms dangling straight down. I remember red rubber coin purses that opened like a pair of lips with a squeeze. I remember a boy who could swig down a Coke in one big gulp, followed by a long, loud belch. I remember just outside the city limits, firecracker booze. So many of you might already be familiar with this. This is a really great kind of catalyst for starting a memoir if you're feeling a little bit stuck. And I think we'll just do that. We'll take 2 minutes, and I want you to just write down as many I remember sentences as you can. Don't think about it, just go. And you can use these as a model. Okay, let's go ahead and stop. Okay. So this is another quick line from emergent strategy that I just love, that I also think is relevant to our discussion. Jeannie Vanasco, a student of biomimicry, says nature/life would always create conditions conducive to life. She tells of a radical fringe of scientists who are realizing that natural selection isn't individual, but mutual. That species only survive if they learn to be in community. How can we, future ancestors, align ourselves with the most resilient practices of emergence as a species? Many of us have been socialized to understand that constant growth, violent competition, and critical mass are the ways to create change. But emergence shows us that adaptation and evolution depend more upon critical, deep, and authentic connections, a thread that can be tugged for support and resilience, the quality of connection between the nodes in the patterns. Dare I say love, and we know how to connect. We long for it. So then we're going to do the second part of this I remember prompt, and I want you to choose a line and expand it. And let's say, since Carla, am I done at 5? I have until 5 or 8.
It's about 8:05 that you.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have time. So just choose one line, and I want you to write down what you remember, expand it as if you were at the age you are now, the age you were at the time. So include everything you saw and heard, write it in present tense as if you're still there, focus on like sensory experience, go down into the memory from your perspective at that time as deeply as you can. And don't forget, add another person or multiple people, dialogue. Try to write at least 5 sentences that you like. Try and get as much of as deeply into a scene as you think you can. And we'll do 2 minutes. Let's do 5 minutes. Take a couple more minutes to wrap up. I'll put Joe Brainerd's questions back on the screen, if that might be helpful. And even if you think you're done, just in these last few seconds, just to try to write one more sentence. Just like keep your hand moving. Okay. So go ahead and find a stopping point. And here I want to talk about Melissa Phoebos, who is a favorite of mine, and it seems like Jeannie's as well. Her book Body Work was really transformative for me. It's basically a book about how it's okay to use memoir as therapy if you want to. You don't have to have therapeuticized yourself out of any emotion about the events in your book to write it. You're allowed to feel things and follow that emotion and let it drive what you write. But that book came out of a lecture that I saw her give actually on Zoom, but at NYU a few years before it came out. And I had notes from it, and yeah, I'm just going to share them here. So and what I'm going to talk about here, she's talking about her memories of a really terrible and abusive romantic relationship she was in. She wrote a book about it called Abandon Me, and she writes of her girlfriend, I had worshipped her like a god, both cruel and adoring. I asked her what only God could provide. I used her the way I'd once used heroin, and I'd become just as powerless over my compulsion. So she says, I often tell my students about the importance of authorial distance. The eye of their narrator is not the eye that writes the book. It's not the complex and fluctuating matrix that makes up their self or their personality or their identity. It is a personification of a single strand of these, the one that occupies their story of the past, which is also a single strand plucked from a larger matrix. So I want you to think about that line, a single strand plucked from a larger matrix. And what are we talking about, right? Your story is a single strand in this matrix, but it involves everything else in the matrix. And it's up to you to hone, to focus that energy, right? It looks like electricity. You want to hone all of that energy and all of that force into one little thread that's coming off of the matrix. But to do that, you need to be aware of the entire context of everything you're writing in and about and through. Okay. So she writes, successful narration of personal narrative depends upon the careful interplay of the past I and the present, whether it be explicit or implicit in the text. Self-knowledge, the insights unavailable in the past and acquired in the time since, are what give memoir its steps. So this is interesting, actually, because like Jeannie was saying, like the hero's journey doesn't work structurally as a guide for her. And it's same with me. It never made any sense to me. I actually have a lot to say about it, but that's for a different lecture. But what does work is following your emotion and figuring out where the heat is for you and writing out of those moments and letting those be your guideposts and the structural point for your book. It is not experience that qualifies a person to write a memoir. It is insight into experience and the ability to tell a story of the past that contains both dimensions. That is, the past experience that has been integrated into the larger narrative of the author's life. For me, and I believe for most people who write from personal experience, the process of writing is also a process of comprehension and examination of the past that yields a new understanding. So it's that transformative process. It's you now, it's you in the past, it's you're communicating with the you in the past, and it's what emerges from that. And that's the memoir. It's a process. It's going like that all the time. She also says, I've read memoirs, probably you have too, that unfold with the texture of unprocessed traumatic memory. The prose in such a book might be technically astute, but it's also repetitive and opaque. It does not develop or progress in time, and it does not reveal the storyteller's feelings or interpretation of events. I've often described writing as a diorama that I populate, not only with my accessible memories, but also the memories that I must recover in order to tell the complete story. So if you're writing about, to use Jeannie's example, a time when your mother was mean to you, if you're not also thinking about who your mother is, where she came from, why that moment's happening, where you're coming from in that moment, all of the stuff that might not even end up on the page, it is going to feel like unprocessed traumatic memory, and it might not affect the reader. And that's because you're not going deep enough into your own emotions around this moment. You're presenting it the way it's frozen in your memory. And that's not necessarily going to be the most effective way to convey what you're trying to say with that moment. So this is the last prompt we'll do. And I want you to take that memory that you drew upon for the last two prompts. I want you to rewrite it, but from the point of view of your current self. I want you to try to incorporate emotions that you felt back then and the emotions you have about that moment now. Before we were focusing on sensory detail and sensory perception, and in this draft, we're going to focus on feeling the emotions we have around that moment. Let's do it for about 5 minutes. If it looks like people are done sooner than that, we'll move on. Okay, start wrapping up, and if you're done, just try to keep writing and finish out the minute. Try to sharpen anything that might feel a little bit vague. Any ideas you started but didn't really go into, take this time now to see what happens if you follow that thread. Great. Okay. So this is also from Melissa's book, which suggests to me that she saw the same thing that I saw and that Octavia Butler saw, and that this is something that writers and artists have been noticing forever. There are geometric shapes that recur in nature, the shapes on which it is most possible to build, known by carpenters and tides and insects. We also, in our rituals of healing, creation, and repentance, are performing a pattern that has occurred at the center of human life as far back as it is recorded. And then this, I just want to leave you with this quote from Rilke, who I actually used some of his work as an epigraph for my book. He's somebody who's been a real sort of North Star for me, and I find this really helpful whenever I'm feeling stuck. He writes, "The reversal of all one's forces, this change direction of soul, can never be accomplished without a number of crises. Most artists avoid it by means of diversions, but that is just why they never again succeed in touching their center of production, from which they started at the moment of their purest impulse. If the angel of inspiration deigns to appear, it will be because you have convinced him, not by tears, but by your humble resolve to be always beginning, to be a beginner. If the meaning of sacrifice is that the moment of greatest danger coincides with that when one is saved, then certainly nothing resembles sacrifice more than this terrible will to art. It is we who are the real awakeners of our monsters, to which we are not hostile enough to become their conquerors, for in a certain sense we are at one with them. It is they, the monsters, that hold the surplus strength which is indispensable to those that must surpass themselves. Unless one assigns to the act of victory a mysterious and far deeper meaning, it is not for us to consider ourselves the tamers of our internal lions, but suddenly we feel ourselves walking beside them, as in triumph, without being able to remember the exact moment when this inconceivable reconciliation took place. So we don't have to worry about taming our emotions, taming our instincts, taming our will. We can ride them, we can follow them, we can let them lead us to the work that we're supposed to produce. Oops. Okay. I think I'll stop here. I have one more prompt, but I think it'll take too long. But I guess I don't know. I'll just say people will tune into your work if it makes them feel something, and it's only going to make them feel something if it makes you feel something. And if you finish a thing, even if it gets rejected, it means you finished a thing and you can finish more things. That's the biggest takeaway I had from having published a book. I had to learn to think of the criticism that surprised me about my work in a curious way and not as a referendum on my abilities. Same with every failure. What can I learn from this? And what I've learned over time is that everything I write is a rehearsal for what comes next, so long as I'm working. It's like a station that's tough to find, but once you tune into it, you can't stop hearing it. The point is to outlast your own doubt. The only thing you can control is working every day, right? You can't control anything else, but that's actually quite a bit. Your will, the will that you're exerting by writing every day will shape the world around you because you live in constant communication with the world around you. Yeah, my final prompt is usually to have people write intentions for their work for the next year. I don't think we have time to do that now, but I would invite you to do that at some point. In the same way we wrote questions at the beginning. What is the best possible answer to those questions for you? Sometimes if you write them out, that will give you kind of the guidance you need to get to the next step or the next level with whatever it is you're working on. But we are almost at time, so I will stop there.
Thank you, Sarah. Can we thank Sarah for this wonderful presentation? Wow. I think I'm going to see trees everywhere now that I.
Great, good. That's my goal.
But thank you so much for sharing meaningful ways to organize our manuscripts and to rethink structure and to consider the multiple stories that we can develop from a singular starting point. We are always learning and deeply grateful for this experience this evening with both of you. Um, Folks, I hope you are taking notes and listing your questions. So we're going to open it up to Q&A. Please just, raise your hands and we'll try to make sure we have 3 people looking. So we'll see who has questions. When you're called on, take yourself off mute to answer those questions. Make sure you introduce yourself and ask the question, and we'll try to honor everyone's time. Anyone have questions? And please, we have 2 great writers here who have shared a ton of information and ways to approach writing. It is not a time to be shy. It is a time to ask questions. I know that last exercise really made me rethink a scene that I had initially wrote. And I love the idea that you told us to do it again from an adult perspective and what we're thinking now. Does anyone have questions? Anyone want to start? Christina.
Thank you, ladies. You've really helped me with a lot of what I was trying to handle. So one of my questions was, so I submitted a chapter of what I thought would be in my memoir, and the critique came back for me to, like, they thought one part of the story of the whole chapter was like, that is where I should begin. And my first thought, because I don't know anything about writing memoirs, I just thought each chapter would be a person. But now that I got this critique, and now that you all showed me different ways of trying to come up with it, I'm wondering how do I restructure it? Do I just start back at that original story, or I'm not trying to cram 45 years into a memoir now. Like, I thought that's what I had to do, but from what I hear you saying is take one moment and make that the plot point. So what do you suggest? Do you suggest like the most like dramatic, or maybe something sensitive? Like, how do you start off?
Yeah, I mean, Sarah, do you have, one thing that immediately comes to mind is just thinking about like, what are your intentions? So I'm often, I was doing an interview recently and somebody asked me something. I was like, I don't know how to write a book. And it just kind of came out like, I really don't, I still don't think I know how to write a book. And I mean that genuinely. Because I feel like every time you're starting over or the intentions are different. And so, Sarah, I don't know if there's anything you have to say. I think my one question would be like, what are you going for? I mean, I think that's the thing to ask yourself, because sometimes when people give feedback, it's what they want and not what you want or what the work needs to have. I don't know.
That's
Yeah.
what I'm confused about, because I don't want to change it. Like, I know the story
Yeah.
is that I want to come from today's view of the things that happened to me as a child. Like, I it's really about mothers and daughters and changing the pathology.
Mhm.
I'm not a psychologist, but I have had extensive years of therapy and I can now verbalize what I've seen, but I don't want to get into like those stories are probably the most salacious, but I want to come from a point of view of what I think was happening at the time. You understand what I mean?
I I understand that. I was in sort of a similar situation. I was writing about my mentally ill mother and trying to reconfigure the way I understood my childhood after she was diagnosed with schizophrenia in her 50s. And I went on circles. I tried to start from like a clinical perspective. I tried to start from like a more theoretical perspective. And eventually, my editor was like, you need to start with the part that you feel the most. It's not about the reader. It's not, and it's not about sort of dramatizing something in a way that might feel voyeuristic. It's about like, what is the question that this book is trying to answer? For me, it was what caused my mom's psychotic break. So I'm going to start with finding out that she'd had a psychotic break. That's kind of the clearest way.
I got you now. Because what I'm trying to answer is, why did my grandmother mess up my mother?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I got you. Thank you.
And then people will ask you along the line, why did you write this book? And it sounds like you have an answer. And that's where you should start, with sort of that question and your desire to answer it.
Okay. Thank you. Oh, and let me ask you a question, since I have you. Like, how do you get to an editor? Like, do you just Google
Christina?
people? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, let's wait to see if there's someone else has a question. Okay, I know you're excited. Does anyone else have a question? Can you raise your hand or?
It looks like Cherry has
Yeah, we
their
have
hand
Cherry and
raised.
Joy.
Okay, Sherry and then Joy, please. Unmute and then.
Yeah, you can't see my face, but can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I wrote memoirs in short story form and poems. What I did, not using the real people's names, but that's how I wrote them. And like I said, in short story form and in poems, and just told about the event. And some were published and some weren't, but I got the idea through. Um, and they were about childhood molestation. They were about how parents can, one was called about the root, and it was, I compared small children as plants. And when you have plants and you don't nourish the plant, and the plant starts to die, and it starts to die in the root. And yeah, that's what I did. And I started with the event, whatever the event was in the memoir, and just put it to poetry, or I just put it to a short story. And that's how I did it. And that's what worked for me.
Well, Sherry, what's your question?
Oh, my question, I'm sorry. My question is this: is this a one night thing, or are you going to have this every week?
This is just this moment. Sorry.
Oh, okay. Because it's so good. And the presenters were excellent. I really enjoyed this. And yeah, okay. But that's it. Thanks.
Thank you for that comment, Sherry. Just stick around. Joy, can you ask your question?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm sorry. I'm having some technical difficulty with Zoom right now, but I guess I wanted to ask, when you're figuring out what angle to approach your story, like for example, like let's say you have a story on ice cream. You can start from the melting, you can start from the joy of the ice cream, you can start from the memory of summer or convincing your mom to give you the money. I mean, it's all ice cream, but there's so many different angles. And from the relationship of trying to actually get published, because there is an element of it needing to be, I guess, widely acceptable. In your own individual practices, how do you go about that? Because I know you kind of mentioned a little bit earlier, like, don't really care about the reader. But does that apply if you are just starting out and really are trying to get your first book out? You do need, I guess, a more universal story. So I don't know, how do you, in your own individual writing practices, figure out what part of the story you want to begin with?
I think it depends on where you're wanting to get published. I think for years, even now, I read every literary magazine. Like I just read an immense amount. I would go to the library in New York. There was a library where they were all free, and I would just read Plowshares and the Paris Review, and I just read constantly. I went to readings constantly. I think it was more just a sense of like, what is the caliber of writing that I'm trying to achieve? How can I like consume so much of it that it shapes the way that I write, honestly? Because those editors are the people who you would want to be publishing your work. So you figure out what your taste is. What do you love? who's doing it at the highest possible level and then read as much of it as possible. That's
Lorinda, you want to ask your question? Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And the
Eric,
discussion has been, oh, I'm sorry, can you hear me?
yes, I wasn't sure
Um,
if you could beat her.
yes. The discussion has been amazing and really inspiring. My question is about what happens if you've gotten really far in your writing process. You even had beta readers, you've done the whole things are looking good. You may have been working on proposals. But you've had other life things that have happened. Like for me, I had gotten married, I was planning a wedding, bought a house, did all of those things. But then taking time to go back to some of your earlier content, it's almost like that moment of like looking back at your diary when you're 14. So when you have new perspectives, but you've gotten so far in your work and you want to be done and you want to publish and you want to go through that process, how do you either go back to it without tearing up the whole thing, but also now that you have different perspectives on certain things, how do you not turn it into something else, or should you?
That's a great question. Because I remember getting really stuck when working on my first book and thinking like, okay, what is my narrative present? Or what is like the processing present? Or when is this unfolding? Because life keeps going on, right? So you could keep doing it conceivably. And I think um uh understanding that like you're not limited to writing one memoir, right? So you've got, it sounds like you've got one, right? You're saying you have the full draft. Okay. Um, and you're happy with that draft? Yes, like you want to like polish it, but you think it's or like what else has to be done, do you think?
I'm semi happy with it. I have
Okay.
a bunch of essays, so there are certain essays where I'm like, yes, we're where we want to be. That's good. But since the time I had, originally written the first draft, there are some things that have changed politically and, or just how do I go in to maybe touch some of those other essays, but not undo maybe some of the good work that I did previously, but still maybe incorporate what's important to me now, or maybe how I might have shifted on some things that I might have felt strongly about before that kind of shaped the story. So I just feel like there's a mix of things happening. There are things that I definitely want to keep. And then there are other things where I'm like looking back on, what I wrote originally or the space that I was in. There were certain things now where I'm like, I'm kind of less angry about that thing, or I'm not, I see things a little bit differently now, but how do I not go in the rabbit hole of feeling like, oh my God, I've got to rewrite everything when I had really wonderful people to help me vet it and go through the beta read and all of that and not just tear it all up.
And one more question, is it a memoir and essays, it sounds like, or an essay collection or
Yeah.
okay. um I mean, I don't know, Sarah, do you have my thinking is, well, actually, I want to think on that. Sarah, does something immediately come to mind for you?
I mean, at a certain point, you have to just see that it's done and it's the version of you that wrote the best thing they could and be done and write the next thing. I think I had to learn that.
I agree. And I think what you could do is write essays from the now. Like, so keeping what you have before. I think a really interesting book. I love when something begins from one place and the person is an entirely different person at the end, or like it shifts. It could be that maybe this is the book, and then like your next one, you're writing essays that are challenging your previous self in some way, or that the book contains more essays and some of those essays are like contradicting your past self or challenging yourself, or like that could be really interesting because I think most readers understand that this is like you at a particular moment in time, and the person who you are at the end of the book is very different, especially the person promoting the book is very different from the person who was like the character in the book. So, yeah, I think writing new essays that are looking back at that, but I agree with Sarah, just like revising what you have from trying to do it from the point of view of who you were, kind of like that excellent writing prompt that Sarah had
Mhm.
at the end, right? Like of thinking about um, trying to like inhabit that time then, but then playing around with recovering um, the thoughts and feelings. Does that make sense?
Yes, no, this helps. All of the feedback has definitely been helpful. Thank
Okay, great.
you.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Oh, so we have Sadia and then we have Heather.
Hi, I wrote a chapter of the memoir that I've now finished about 7 years ago. I had a friend of a friend who introduced me to a big deal agent. She said, "Listen, if you write this book, I'll sell it." It took me 7 years, but I sent it to her, and I was very excited to send it to her recently. And she kind of blew me off. And then I got like this sort of like form-ish email that I don't think she really read it, but she basically said, look, it's too hard to sell memoirs right now, like unless you're famous or unless it's like super, super controversial, which I feel like mine is like kind of like it is like a mother-daughter thing, but it like changed spousal rape laws in the US and like it has like all of this kind of like political, important, like timely stuff. At least, obviously I'm biased, but it was just sort of a bummer. And I guess is she right? Or is that just like a thing that people say when they don't want to like deal with you? Or, yeah, what is your take on that as memoirists?
I mean, I know that publishing is brutal right now for even my friends who are on their third book that have had two books come out that were critically acclaimed and well received in every possible way. Either their books are coming out and they're not getting reviewed at all, or they're not selling. I mean, it does seem like the landscape has fundamentally changed. So she's not just saying that. I think even super agents are having a really hard time selling books, but it's always hard, and there's no reason for you to feel like you're obliged to only work with this agent. There's a million agents. I would eventually, it's kind of a numbers game, and I would try to like maybe place some essays if you can, if you haven't, like just try and build up a little bit of a resume so you can say, I don't know what your resume is, but just so you have something to say when you're querying them or pitching them, or try to go to like Breadloaf or Ten House or Kenyon or one of those summer programs where you can workshop your work and then also they bring agents in so you're meeting someone in person. Just kind of try all the different avenues to get someone to read it.
Thank you.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I agree with Sarah. I don't think the agent was just saying that. I do think it is really hard to sell memoirs now, and the way, I mean, there are fewer reviewing outlets now. The way books are being read, I don't, um, are becoming popular. It's very confusing to me. I don't know. I have a friend who runs a bookstore and who said it used to be people would come in for a book and a bunch of people would come in for the same book and she'd think, oh, okay, there was a review in the New York Times. And she says now it's so unpredictable. It's like, oh, something took off on TikTok. So like the what we used to have as conventional markers of something getting attention, it's entirely thrown off. And I think agents are trying to adjust to that. So the other thing you could think about is look at literary. I mean, you probably have already done this, looking at the acknowledgments of books you love and who are the agents, but then also looking at newer literary agencies that are really great, but are looking for new clients and that are maybe expanding. So one that comes to mind is Trellis, Trellis. They're relatively new and really incredible and seem to be adding more and more agents. So that would be something. I mean, I think like newer literary agencies or younger agents who are looking to build their list, who are going to have more time and aren't necessarily looking for the easiest sale. Um, those might be the people to query.
And Heather, you want to take yourself off mute?
Hi, thank you for this, you guys. Um, a really quick question. How do you think about when to begin to incorporate your trusted readers? Like when do you open the door to the people that are going to give you good, useful feedback, but sometimes it's too soon for that? How do you make that choice?
Jeannie, I'd be curious to know what you have to say about this, actually.
Yeah, so with my with my third book, I didn't I mean, not even I don't even share my book with my partner, Chris. Like, I mean, he gets to read it at the very, make sure I didn't embarrass him or something. But it has been different for each book. So, like, my first book, I was writing it while I was in an MFA program. And I found from experience that that was not very healthy because how some people are reading it, they're reading it for what they want it to do and not maybe what you want it to do. So it's like figuring out who is like your ideal audience. So for my second book, a few of my very close friends served as readers and they were reading it as I was kind of going. And I had people who were working in other genres. And that was unusual for me. I don't usually share work like that. And then the third book, I didn't share it with anyone until like until it was in supposed to be coming out. Like, and my editor had it and it was going to go to the proofreader and so on. So it was pretty late in the process. So it really it I don't know, it varies. It depends, I think, on how close I am or how stubborn I'm going to be, I think. If I think like this is how I want to do it and I don't want anyone telling me otherwise, then I'm just going to hold off on sharing it. There isn't really, I don't really have a science to it or a process. I don't know, Sarah, do you share work with friends?
Yeah, it's similar. I think when I first started writing, my husband is also a writer and he's a screenwriter, but he was much further along in his career than me. And so I would show him my stuff because he was very good at pointing out just structural issues and places where I was maybe being lazy. And he didn't really have it wasn't the same as showing it to a prose writer because there wasn't that same sense of like maybe competition because he was working in a totally different medium, but he did know how to read and he knew what story it was supposed to look like. As I've gotten more confident, I just like will try and keep the stakes low. I try to write towards a grant application or a residency application, and I'll have 20 pages, and then I'll send to a friend who owes me a read, like, hey, I'm applying for McDowell or whatever. Will you read these? And so then it feels less like this is a referendum on my entire manuscript and project, and more just like, help me out with this application. And that's what I've been doing with the book I'm working on now.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Thanks.
And sometimes I will say, like my friends, I mean, it's maybe with the nature of the type of writing I do, they end up being characters and they're aware, like I do get their permission. And I'm very lucky that a lot of my friends are writers so that I'll say, you appear on these pages. And like, it's fine. I trust you. And I'm like, well, could you please look? I just want to make sure because I care about our friendship. So I find that sometimes sharing work can be helpful in that regard with friends who I know are willing to be characters. Um, but yeah, I mean the latest book, and I don't know if it was a mistake or not. I didn't want to share it with many people. Um, yeah.
Well, thank you, Sarah Labrie, and thank you, Jeannie Vanasco, for this incredible, dynamic information session. I don't write memoir, but I took enough notes, and it really has inspired me as a prose writer. But please show them some love. We appreciate you coming out tonight. We're going to put a link to Greedy Reads in the chat. Please support these writers. Support them now, their current books, their past books, their future books, and follow them on their social media. Just support them in whatever way you can. We hope you learned a lot. Their two books are A Silent Treatment and No One Gets to Fall Apart. Two incredible books. We do want you to stick around a little bit to fill out our evaluations because we want to know how we can do this better. We want you to continue to follow CityLit Project, sign up for our mailing list. We have two events coming up, A Home for the Heart to Live In, a gathering of Cave Canem Fellows, which will be at the Motor House on Sunday, December 7th, an afternoon of poetry, which is always spectacular. And we have our 23rd CityLit Festival coming up, held in partnership with Maryland Center for History and Culture on Saturday, April 11th, 2026. Please save the date. But more than anything, we're a small but fierce literary nonprofit. Our events are free, and the only way we can do this is by your support and your just showing up and spreading the word about CityLit. Do know too that AWP is headed to Baltimore next year from March 4th through the 7th. And we're planning our own little AWP dance party on Friday, March 6th. So mark your calendars. You'll receive information from us. We're going to say goodbye to Sarah and to Jeannie right now. And we just kind of want to say we would love to have you back at some point in time. It's been an incredible evening. I think we've learned a lot, and we'll make sure everybody gets your handouts and your slides, which were pretty remarkable. So please, you can come off chat. I mean, you can come off mute for a second so they can hear the applause and not just see it.
Thank you guys so much. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.